For decades, the US and Iran have been locked in this Cold War of sanctions, threats, and proxy fights. But what if I told you that for one weekend, behind the closed doors of a luxury hotel, they actually talked? We're going to go inside the secret negotiations that brought these two rivals to the very brink of a historic deal and figure out what made it all just fall apart. So get this. After more than 20 hours of these super intense talks, a source who was right there in the room said the two sides were very close to an agreement. Their words, not mine. 80% there. 80%. So if they were that close, what on earth could have happened? What was the one thing that stopped a massive potential breakthrough right in its tracks? All right, so picture the scene. We're at the Serena Hotel in Islamabad, and this wasn't just any old meeting. This was the first direct face-to-face sit-down between Washington and Tehran in over a decade. The real weight of this whole situation, though, becomes crystal clear when you realize exactly who was in that room. Yeah, this was not a meeting between some low-level diplomats, no way. This was a serious, top-tier engagement with some of the most powerful people from both countries, with Pakistani mediators basically trying to play referee and somehow bridge this enormous gap between them. I mean, the seniority of the players tells you everything you need to know about how serious this was. From the American side, you've got Vice President J.D. Vance. Representing Iran, Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Look, these weren't just messengers. These were the decision makers. That alone signals just how critical these talks were. And you have to understand the historical weight of this moment. This was the highest level meeting between the US and Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution completely changed their relationship forever. We're talking about 40 years of pure hostility leading up to this one moment in one hotel in Pakistan. But, as it turns out, a decades-old disagreement would very quickly become the main event. You know, at the very heart of this whole thing was one single defining issue: uranium enrichment. Both sides came to the table ready to make a deal, but their ideas of what that deal should look like, well, they were on completely different planets. Okay, so here's the fundamental problem right here. The US came in demanding a 20-year freeze on Iran's uranium enrichment. Iran's counteroffer, a 5-year freeze. It's so simple when you see it laid out like that, but it reveals this massive, massive canyon in what each side expected, and how little they trusted each other. 15 years. That was the gap. That's what they had to close. And this wasn't some minor detail they could iron out later. This was the absolute core of the entire negotiation. A 15-year difference on something as sensitive as nuclear capability, that is a monumental, almost impossible obstacle. But, you know, it would be way too simple to think this was only about enrichment timelines. The nuclear file was definitely the headline issue, but there was a whole mess of other critical conflicts all tangled up in these talks. The negotiators were also trying to deal with the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which is a vital artery for global energy, by the way. For Iran, the absolute key was getting relief from these crippling international sanctions. And maybe most importantly, they couldn't even agree on the scope of a deal. The US wanted to keep it narrow, nukes and Hormuz, while Iran was pushing for a much, much broader agreement. Okay, so now let's go inside that negotiating room. Because the reports from behind those closed doors, they paint a picture of incredible tension, just raw distrust, and moments where the whole thing nearly blew up completely. Think about this. For over 20 hours, these delegations were locked in discussion. And to keep everyone focused and prevent leaks, phones were totally banned from the main room. We're talking about officials as high up as the US vice president having to physically step outside during breaks just to send messages back home. This quote from two senior Iranian sources who were actually there, it just says everything. There was no pretending to be friendly. They described the atmosphere as heavy and unfriendly and said that even with the Pakistani mediators trying to lighten the mood, neither side was willing to back down an inch. And this moment right here, this really shows you the deep, deep distrust. Sources say that Iran's normally pretty mild-mannered foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, got really sharp when they started talking about guarantees. He just directly challenged the US, pointing to a time when an attack allegedly happens just 2 days after a previous round of talks. The tension, it wasn't just something you could feel, you could actually hear it. A Pakistani government source reported that at one point it got so intense that you could hear raised voices from the negotiations all the way outside the room. I mean, any sense of professional calm was clearly cracking under the pressure. And get this is how volatile it got. The argument became so heated that the Pakistani mediators literally had to step in and call a tea break. They physically separated the two sides into different rooms just to let everyone cool off. So, after the marathon session, the shouting, and that unbridgeable 15-year gap, the talks ended. No deal. So, where does that leave things now? Well, here's the twist. Despite the total failure in Islamabad, officials on both sides were quick to insist that the dialogue wasn't dead. Apparently, they were already talking about a possible second round of talks even before the ink was dry on the first one's failure. And right after the talks, the public message from the White House was surprisingly optimistic. President Trump came out and said that Iran had called and that, in his words, they'd like to work a deal. It really suggests that even after that incredibly tense meeting, both sides were purposefully leaving the door open. But all that optimism doesn't change the bottom line. The White House was also really firm in making its ultimate position clear, and the talks hadn't changed it one bit. The one red line that President Trump's team stuck to was simple. Iran can never, ever have a nuclear weapon. And that leaves us with this incredible paradox, right? The dialogue is somehow still alive, but the distrust is just so deep. They were 80% there, but still separated by a 15-year gap on the single most important issue. It all leads to the ultimate question. Can diplomacy actually work here when 40 years of conflict have failed